In the humid lowlands and volcanic highlands of ancient Mesoamerica, long before the civilization known as the Maya took form, a quiet revolution in human organization was already unfolding. Across these regions, small groups of farmers began transforming the landscape, marking the transition from mobile hunting and gathering to settled agricultural life. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Guanajuato in Oaxaca and the valleys of Chiapas reveals early experiments with domesticating maize, beans, and squash as early as 5000 BCE. These innovations provided the foundation for more stable food supplies, enabling permanent villages to develop across fertile floodplains and forest clearings. Over generations, these communities refined their agricultural practices, storing surplus crops and managing irrigation, which allowed population densities to grow. This process did not create civilization overnight, but it established the ecological and social preconditions for it. As farming expanded, the Mesoamerican environment became a shared laboratory for innovation. The interplay of lowlands and highlands created diverse ecological zones, each producing distinctive resources: cacao from the tropical forests, obsidian from volcanic mountains, and salt from coastal flats. Exchange among these zones promoted interaction and interdependence, fostering the emergence of long-distance trade. Archaeologists have found early evidence of such exchange networks in obsidian blades discovered far from their geological sources, a sign of organized movement of goods and ideas. Over time, this economic web linked disparate groups into a regional cultural sphere. It was within this sphere that the first symbols of hierarchy and belief began to take shape. Among the earliest known centers of social and ritual complexity was the Olmec civilization, whose influence spanned much of the Gulf Coast from about 1500 to 400 BCE. Sites like San Lorenzo and La Venta reveal a remarkable leap in urban planning, art, and governance. Massive basalt heads, carved to represent rulers, suggest an early form of political centralization based on divine kingship. The Olmec also engineered monumental earth platforms and ceremonial complexes aligned to celestial events, demonstrating a growing concern with cosmology and order. Their art and iconography, jaguar motifs, crossband symbols, and depictions of rulers emerging from caves or serpent jaws, became enduring visual themes in later Mesoamerican cultures, including the Maya. Through trade and cultural diffusion, Olmec ideas about authority, ritual, and urban design spread across the region, leaving an intellectual blueprint for later civilizations. The Olmec were not an empire, but a constellation of interlinked centers that drew on shared religious and artistic traditions. Their ceremonial sites served as focal points for both local and regional gatherings, where elites might have exchanged goods, spouses, and political alliances. These interactions helped formalize a system in which ritual performance was inseparable from political legitimacy. Archaeological evidence of imported jade, polished mirrors, and finely crafted ceramics shows that elite exchange was a defining feature of status. This pattern, the association between material wealth, ritual power, and social rank, would later appear in the Maya lowlands, refined and institutionalized into a complex hierarchy. Parallel to the Olmec heartland, other regions of Mesoamerica were developing their own trajectories. In the highlands of Guatemala, early ceremonial centers such as Caminalju began to emerge around 1000 BC. There, communities took advantage of fertile volcanic soils and strategic trade routes connecting the Pacific coast with interior valleys. Caminalju's platform mounds and stone monuments reveal contact with both Gulf Coast and central Mexican cultures. This demonstrates that by the end of the first millennium BCE, Mesoamerica had become a network of interacting societies, each contributing to a shared symbolic vocabulary. The widespread appearance of the ball game, played in formal courts lined with stone, illustrates how a single cultural practice could link distant communities under a common ritual code. The cultivation of maize remained the central thread tying these developments together. Beyond its nutritional value, maize acquired profound symbolic meaning, representing fertility, renewal, and the human connection to the earth. Myths preserved in later Maya texts, such as the Popol Vuh, trace human creation to maize dough, reflecting a belief with deep prehistoric roots. The transition from wild Teosini grass to fully domesticated maize was a technological achievement that required centuries of selection and experimentation. This agricultural success allowed communities to accumulate surpluses, support specialized labor, and invest in monumental construction. As food production stabilized, populations increased, and the need for coordination and record-keeping grew accordingly. The archaeological record from early sites like Paso de la Amada in Chiapas demonstrates how these dynamics began to create recognizable leadership structures. Around 1400 BCE, the community constructed one of the earliest known ball courts in Mesoamerica alongside large residential compounds for local elites. These physical markers of hierarchy suggest the emergence of hereditary status and organized governance. Leaders likely derived authority from their ability to manage trade, ritual, and agricultural productivity. In this context, religion and administration were inseparable. Cosmic order justified political control, and political success reinforced religious prestige. This early fusion of power and piety became a hallmark of all later Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Maya. Material innovations paralleled social transformation. The mastery of pottery allowed for better food storage, cooking, and trade. Distinctive ceramic styles, such as the red-slipped ware of Chiapas and the fine gray pottery of Oaxaca, reveal regional identities and chronological sequences. These artifacts serve as markers for archaeologists tracing the diffusion of ideas and the emergence of cultural boundaries. The spread of ceramics also indicates expanding networks of artisans, traders, and consumers, demonstrating that even small-scale societies were part of broader economic systems. By the Middle Preclassic period, between 1000 and 400 BCE, these interconnected communities were laying the infrastructural and ideological groundwork for urban life. The gradual organization of labor was another decisive step. Monumental earthworks and public architecture required collective effort beyond the household level. Coordinating such projects implied new social mechanisms, leaders who could mobilize and sustain large groups for shared goals. This coordination was likely achieved through kinship ties, ritual obligations, and emerging political hierarchies. As public spaces became more formalized, they reinforced social cohesion and authority. Plazas, temples, and altars provided not only venues for ceremony, but also the physical expression of a society's collective identity. This dynamic, using space to embody social order, would reach its architectural pinnacle in the great Maya cities that followed. While the Olmec provided cultural templates, the transition toward distinctly Maya patterns occurred gradually in the southeastern periphery of their influence. Excavations at sites such as Cuello in Belize reveal continuous habitation from around 1200 BCE through the first millennium BCE. There, archaeologists uncovered early evidence of raised platforms, burial offerings, and decorated ceramics, demonstrating the rise of local elites. Similarly, at Nakbi in the Petén Basin, monumental architecture began to appear by 800 BCE, centuries before the classic Maya era. The scale of construction at Nakbi suggests organized labor and centralized planning, implying that social complexity was already well underway in the lowlands. These early centers shared features that would later define the Maya world: stepped pyramids, ceremonial plazas, and alignment with astronomical events. They also reveal an evolving relationship between humans and their environment. The Maya heartland's karstic terrain required innovation in water management, as surface rivers were scarce. Even in this formative stage, communities developed reservoirs and canals to harness seasonal rainfall, foreshadowing the hydraulic engineering of later centuries. The adaptation to such challenging landscapes encouraged not only technical ingenuity, but also a worldview that linked survival to celestial and environmental cycles. One striking insight from modern archaeology is the degree to which these early societies were interconnected across vast distances. Isotopic analysis of obsidian artifacts shows that even isolated villages participated in trade extending hundreds of kilometers. Goods moved along river corridors and overland trails, but with them traveled stories, rituals, and technologies. This diffusion did not erase local identities. Rather, it enriched them. Each community adopted, modified, or reinterpreted shared symbols according to its own traditions. By 500 BCE, the cultural mosaic of Mesoamerica had achieved remarkable cohesion, allowing scholars today to speak of a unified Mesoamerican civilization long before any single polity dominated the region. The development of writing and counting systems likely began during this integrative phase. The earliest known Mesoamerican calendar dates to around 600 BCE, recorded on monuments associated with the Olmec culture of Veracruz. This calendar, based on interlocking 260-day ritual and 365-day solar cycles, would later become fundamental to Maya timekeeping. Similarly, early glyphic symbols found at sites such as Tres Zapotes anticipate the more elaborate hieroglyphic writing that the Maya perfected centuries later. These innovations reflected a growing intellectual curiosity about order, measurement, and the cyclical nature of existence, concepts that would become central to Maya cosmology. By the late pre-classic period, these cultural threads had woven together into an enduring pattern: agriculture supporting urbanization, ritual legitimizing authority, and trade linking distant regions. The foundations of the Maya world were not the product of isolation, but of cumulative interaction across generations and landscapes. The exchange of ideas and goods across Mesoamerica created the conditions for innovation, while environmental adaptation fostered resilience. When the first great Maya cities rose in the jungles of the lowlands, they did so upon a legacy stretching back millennia, built by countless communities whose names are now lost, but whose influence endures in every temple and glyph. The importance of this early phase lies not merely in its chronology, but in its structure. The societal frameworks established during the pre-Maya period, economic specialization, religious hierarchy, and urban design, were replicated and refined on a grander scale by their successors. The Maya inherited a world already organized around sacred kingship, agricultural cycles, and cosmic order. They did not invent civilization anew. They inherited its logic and expanded it. The roots of their achievements can thus be traced to these early Mesoamerican pioneers who transformed subsistence economies into complex social systems. In modern research, LiDAR mapping and radiocarbon dating have confirmed that early Mesoamerican centers were far more sophisticated than once believed. Large-scale construction projects, some previously hidden beneath jungle canopies, demonstrate that population densities and organizational capacity rivaled later periods. Such discoveries have prompted historians to reconsider the timeline of civilization in the region, recognizing that the Maya did not emerge suddenly, but gradually evolved from these interconnected societies. Each discovery, whether a fragment of pottery or a buried plaza, reinforces the idea that history advances through continuity rather than abrupt invention. The shift from dispersed villages to ceremonial hubs also reflects the deepening of ideological systems. As elites gained control over surplus resources, they invested in religious expression as a means of consolidating power. The alignment of architecture to celestial phenomena, solstices, equinoxes, and planetary movements, underscored the belief that rulers maintained balance between the human and cosmic realms. This principle of harmony would later govern every aspect of Maya governance, calendar making, and ritual practice. Thus, the first temples and plazas of pre-Maya Mesoamerica were not only centers of worship, but also instruments of political communication. Over the centuries, this fusion of economy, religion, and leadership created a stable framework capable of sustaining larger populations and more intricate social hierarchies. It also encouraged record-keeping and the standardization of symbols, which allowed for collective memory to extend across generations. In this sense, the seeds of literacy, mathematics, and astronomy were already germinating in the soil of early Mesoamerican villages. The people who first tracked the movements of Venus or measured the length of a growing season were unknowingly laying the intellectual groundwork for one of the most sophisticated knowledge systems in the pre-Columbian world. By the first centuries BCE, the cultural map of Mesoamerica was dense with thriving centers, each contributing to a shared civilization defined by agriculture, monumentality, and ideology. Yet these were still formative societies, testing, experimenting, and adapting. The balance they achieved between human ambition and environmental constraint was delicate, and from that balance emerged the pattern that would guide the next millennium of development. The transformation from pre-Maya communities to the fully realized Maya civilization was therefore less a revolution than an evolution, a gradual crystallization of ideas and institutions first imagined by their predecessors. The story of the Maya cannot be understood without acknowledging these foundations. From the Olmec's monumental art to the first calendars inscribed on stone, every innovation carried forward the collective knowledge of earlier generations. The Maya inherited this legacy, refined its principles, and extended its reach across the jungles and plains of Central America. Their cities, rituals, and hieroglyphs stand as continuations of an older Mesoamerican dialogue between humanity and the cosmos. As the first Maya settlements began to coalesce in the lowlands, they were not emerging in isolation but stepping into a civilization already in motion, guided by patterns that had been evolving for thousands of years. This deep continuity defines the earliest chapter of Maya history. It shows how environment, innovation, and exchange combined to produce the conditions from which the Maya would rise. The story now turns to that emergence, to the moment when scattered farming villages of the lowlands transformed into the first organized Maya communities, laying the groundwork for a civilization that would one day shape the intellectual and artistic horizons of an entire region. Across the lowlands of Belize, Guatemala, and Mexico's Yucatán Peninsula, the rhythm of life began to change between 2000 and 1000 BCE. Small farming communities, once separated by forest and river, grew into clusters of interconnected villages. Archaeological surveys in the Petén Basin reveal that people were no longer moving seasonally. They were establishing permanent homes built from mud, thatch, and limestone. The landscape itself became an archive of this transformation, as fields, terraces, and water reservoirs appeared in places once dominated by wild vegetation. The domestication of maize, beans, and squash had matured into a reliable agricultural base, allowing populations to expand and specialize. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, this stability was reshaping social organization. Villages now displayed evidence of planned layouts and communal buildings, signaling that leadership and coordination had taken on more formal structures. In sites such as Cuello in northern Belize, one of the earliest known Maya settlements, archaeologists have uncovered continuous occupation layers dating back to around 1200 BCE. The remains of dwellings, pottery kilns, and burial sites provide a detailed picture of everyday life during this formative era. The inhabitants cultivated maize and root crops, supplemented by hunting and fishing, and began experimenting with ceramic technology. The pottery, simple at first, became more refined over time, indicating increasing specialization and aesthetic awareness. Burial practices show early signs of social differentiation, as some graves contained elaborate offerings while others did not. This evidence points to the rise of lineage-based status distinctions, an essential precursor to formal hierarchy. The seeds of nobility, governance, and organized religion were taking root in these early villages, even before monumental architecture appeared. The transition from subsistence farming to complex community life was neither sudden nor uniform. Environmental variation shaped the pace of change. In the upland valleys of Chiapas and the Guatemalan highlands, access to volcanic soils and obsidian gave communities natural advantages. In the lowlands, where water management was critical, survival depended on local ingenuity. The Maya learned to read the seasonal patterns of rainfall and developed methods for storing and channeling water through depressions known as bajos. This adaptation to the landscape was not merely practical. It reflected an emerging worldview in which humans and environment were interdependent. Over centuries, this relationship between geography and society produced the distinctive Maya sensitivity to ecology, visible later in their architecture, agriculture, and mythology. At Nakbi in the northern Petén, a settlement that would become one of the first true urban centers of the Maya world, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of monumental construction as early as 800 BCE. Massive platforms, rising dozens of meters above the forest floor, were built from cut limestone blocks hauled by human labor. These structures were not defensive fortifications, but ceremonial foundations, elevated stages for rituals that bound communities together. Their orientation toward celestial events, such as solstices and equinoxes, indicates a growing concern with cosmic order. The alignment of architecture with the heavens marked a profound conceptual leap. Time and space were now measured through built form. This merging of astronomy, ritual, and urban design would remain a central feature of Maya civilization for over 2,000 years. The building of monumental architecture implies organized leadership capable of mobilizing large groups of workers. Excavations at Nakbi, El Mirador, and Civil show clear evidence of planned civic layouts with plazas, causeways, and temples. These centers were likely governed by early elites whose authority rested on both religious and economic foundations. Control of trade routes and agricultural surplus gave them leverage to sponsor construction and ceremony. The rulers, in turn, claimed divine sanction, presenting themselves as intermediaries between the human and spiritual realms. This relationship between leadership and sacred power was already visible in the pre-classic period and would later define the Maya institution of kingship. Trade continued to expand alongside urban growth. Obsidian from the Guatemalan highlands, jade from the Motagua Valley, and marine shells from coastal regions have been found in inland settlements, revealing extensive exchange networks. These materials were more than commodities. They were symbols of prestige and authority. Access to exotic goods reinforced the social hierarchy, distinguishing elites from commoners. At the same time, trade routes facilitated the spread of ideas, technologies, and iconography. The widespread use of certain motifs, such as serpent imagery or stylized masks, shows that a shared visual language was emerging across Mesoamerica. This cultural cohesion laid the groundwork for a pan-regional identity that the Maya would later inherit and expand. Religion provided the unifying framework for these developing societies. The earliest temples were modest earthen mounds that later evolved into stepped pyramids of stone. Ritual spaces were designed to connect the earthly and celestial realms through offerings, processions, and astronomical observation. The integration of religious architecture into community planning transformed settlements into sacred landscapes. Each structure embodied a cosmological principle: the pyramid as the sacred mountain, the plaza as the world's center, and the temple summit as the meeting place of gods and humans. Through these symbolic designs, early Maya communities expressed their understanding of order, time, and renewal. At Cajalpeche, another early center in Belize, archaeologists found ceremonial complexes dating to around 1000 BCE, demonstrating that religious and civic functions were already intertwined. Public rituals likely reinforced communal identity, while elite households maintained continuity through lineage-based traditions. Offerings of jade beads, shell ornaments, and animal bones in foundation deposits show that religious practice was integral to construction. Every new building was both a technical and spiritual act, linking human effort to divine cycles. Such practices created enduring connections between physical structures and social memory, turning architecture into a form of historical record. Population growth and resource management went hand in hand. As communities expanded, the need for agricultural intensification led to the creation of raised fields, terracing, and crop diversification. This innovation allowed lowland farmers to adapt to variable rainfall and soil conditions. Over centuries, these techniques supported dense populations, making large cities viable. The management of water, soil, and crops was not only an agricultural achievement, but also an administrative one. Coordinating these systems required planning, measurement, and collective labor, skills that mirrored the bureaucratic functions of later Maya polities. Environmental adaptation thus became a driver of social complexity, reinforcing the authority of those who organized production. The cultural significance of maize deepened as it became the axis of sustenance and spirituality. Every stage of its growth corresponded to ritual observances marking sowing, harvest, and renewal. Early Maya iconography shows maize represented as a deity, young, vigorous, and eternally reborn. This association between human fate and agricultural cycles created a worldview where time itself was regenerative. The pattern of planting and reaping provided the template for understanding cosmic balance, an idea that would permeate Maya religion and calendar systems. What began as an agricultural necessity evolved into a central philosophical metaphor for existence. By the end of the first millennium BCE, the distinction between village and city was beginning to blur. Sites like El Mirador, which would later dominate the late pre-classic period, had already begun to take shape. Early construction at El Mirador reveals vast platforms, causeways, and reservoirs, implying centralized planning and collective labor on an unprecedented scale. These developments show that the principles of urban life, organization, hierarchy, and monumental vision were already present. What separated a large village from a city was not simply population size, but the presence of shared institutions that mediated between community and cosmos. The first Maya cities embodied this mediation through architecture, ritual, and governance. Archaeological discoveries continue to refine our understanding of this transition. LiDAR surveys have revealed that early lowland settlements were more numerous and interconnected than previously believed. Beneath the jungle canopy lies evidence of roads, canals, and habitation clusters forming regional networks long before the Classic period. These findings challenge the notion that urbanism arose suddenly. Instead, they suggest a gradual accumulation of complexity, a slow weaving of communities into a unified cultural fabric. This steady growth, rather than abrupt innovation, defines the Maya developmental model. Civilization here was an adaptive process built on continuity, not conquest. Material culture from this period offers a glimpse into the intellectual life of early communities. The introduction of figurines, decorative pottery, and stone tools indicates growing artistic expression and symbolic thought. The use of pigment, especially red ochre, in burials and ceremonies points to an early understanding of color as a marker of sacred transition. The emergence of specialized craft production, whether pottery, jade carving, or textile weaving, reflects both economic specialization and the beginnings of social stratification. Artisans and ritual specialists likely formed a distinct social group, supported by agricultural surpluses and elite patronage. Their skills not only enhanced material life, but also transmitted cultural knowledge across generations. The social organization of these early settlements can be inferred from their spatial layouts. Central plazas surrounded by mounds suggest collective gathering spaces, while residential zones were arranged according to lineage or social status. Household archaeology reveals diversity in building size and artifact distribution, confirming stratification. At the same time, the proximity of elite and commoner dwellings indicates that early hierarchy remained integrated rather than rigidly segregated. This balance between differentiation and cohesion may have contributed to the long-term stability of early Maya society. Leadership remained local and kin-based, sustained by reciprocal obligations rather than coercion. Over time, however, these leaders accumulated symbolic capital that would evolve into hereditary authority. The early use of calendars and simple record-keeping marks another step toward civilization. Although fully developed writing appeared later, the conceptual framework for timekeeping was already in place. Astronomical alignments in early architecture suggest systematic observation of celestial events. The measurement of time was not merely technical but sacred, binding agricultural, religious, and political cycles into a unified system. Each planting season and each ritual date became a point on a larger cosmic rhythm, reinforcing the notion that human life mirrored celestial order. This synthesis of astronomy and ritual would become one of the defining intellectual achievements of the Maya world. As the lowland communities continued to evolve, their interregional connections intensified. Maritime trade along the Caribbean coast linked inland centers with distant cultures, while overland routes crossed the highlands and connected to central Mexico. Through these networks, Goods such as cacao, feathers, and obsidian circulated alongside religious symbols and artistic styles. Cultural diffusion was thus both economic and ideological. The spread of architectural forms, like the triadic pyramid complex found at Nakbi and later replicated at El Mirador, demonstrates how ideas traveled and were reinterpreted across time and space. By 500 BCE, the architecture, religion, and social organization of these communities were unmistakably Maya in form, though still evolving in scale. The consolidation of these developments marked a turning point in the history of the region. The early lowland settlements had created the essential ingredients of civilization: stable agriculture, organized labor, hierarchical leadership, and monumental expression. Yet their most significant legacy lay in the integration of human endeavor with cosmic vision. The built environment reflected celestial order. The calendar mirrored agricultural cycles. Governance derived from ritual performance. Each domain reinforced the others in a self-sustaining system of belief and practice. This synthesis would define the Maya for the next 2 millennia, shaping their approach to science, politics, and art. The transformation from scattered villages to proto-cities thus represents more than demographic growth. It is the moment when human intention became visible in stone. The lowland Maya learned to organize not only their environment, but also their understanding of time, space, and authority. As new centers emerged and connected, they formed the nucleus of what would become the pre-classic Maya world, a civilization in gestation. The following centuries would witness an even greater leap: the rise of divine kings, hieroglyphic writing, and vast ceremonial capitals. The next stage of the story leads into this awakening, when the early foundations of Maya society evolved into the structured, literate, and monumentally ambitious civilization that would dominate the jungles of Mesoamerica for 1,000 years. Between 1000 and 400 BCE, the scattered villages and early centers of the Maya lowlands evolved into a network of organized ceremonial cities that defined the pre-classic Maya world. The foundations laid in the centuries before now produced visible expressions of complex governance, religious ideology, and urban planning. Across sites such as Nakbi, El Mirador, and Cyval, monumental architecture reached unprecedented scale, and a new class of rulers emerged whose authority extended beyond local kinship groups. This period, often referred to as the Middle to Late Pre-Classic, was the era when the Maya civilization took recognizable shape, where theology, astronomy, and political order fused into a coherent cultural system. The jungle canopy concealed but could not contain the growth of vast cities that demonstrated a mastery of both landscape and labor. The city of Nakbi, already a flourishing ceremonial center by 800 BCE, became a prototype for later Maya urbanism. Its layout featured the triadic pyramid complex, a distinctive architectural arrangement consisting of a dominant central pyramid flanked by 2 smaller structures on a single platform. Archaeologists believe this design represented a cosmological concept, possibly related to the 3 hearthstones of creation found in Maya mythology. Whether symbolic or practical, the triadic layout established a spatial vocabulary that would be repeated across the Maya world for over 1,000 years. The massive effort required to build such complexes implies coordinated governance capable of organizing thousands of workers. Evidence of elite residences adjacent to ceremonial structures suggests a ruling class overseeing religious and civic functions. The emergence of a centralized authority at Nakbi foreshadowed the political sophistication of later dynasties. El Mirador, located deep in the northern Peton, would soon surpass Nakbi in scale and ambition. Between 600 and 300 BCE, it became one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas, covering more than 10 square kilometers and featuring monumental platforms rising over 50 meters. The Danta complex, one of the most massive pyramids ever constructed in the ancient world, testifies to extraordinary levels of organization and resource control. Excavations have revealed causeways linking different parts of the city, reservoirs for water storage, and residential areas arranged around ceremonial centers. These features indicate an integrated urban system designed for both ritual and administrative functions. The concentration of monumental architecture at El Mirador suggests that religion and politics were inseparable. Public space was simultaneously sacred space, and civic order reflected cosmic order. The elites who governed these cities likely derived their authority from divine association. Artifacts from the period show the early use of iconography linking rulers to deities, particularly those associated with maize, rain, and celestial cycles. Stone masks and stucco reliefs depict human figures wearing headdresses symbolizing sacred beings, blurring the boundary between mortal and divine. This visual language was not mere decoration. It communicated legitimacy. By aligning themselves with gods and ancestors, rulers positioned their authority within a cosmic hierarchy. Power thus became a reflection of universal balance rather than individual ambition. The ideology of divine kingship, so central to classic Maya politics, was already in formation. Religious expression found its grandest form in the construction of pyramids and plazas. Each new layer of a pyramid often encased the remains of an earlier one, creating a physical timeline of renewal and continuity. Ritual deposits of jade, shell, and ceramics between layers served as offerings to sanctify each phase of construction. These deposits provide a chronological record of ceremonial activity and demonstrate how religious practice was inseparable from urban development. The act of rebuilding was a ritual affirmation of cosmic order. The city itself became a living entity, renewed through collective labor and devotion. Advances in art and writing also emerged during this transformative era. The earliest known examples of Maya hieroglyphic writing appear in the late pre-classic period, notably at San Bartolo, where murals dating to around 100 BCE depict scenes of mythic creation and ritual performance. These images include glyphs that represent names, places, and ceremonial actions, suggesting that the Maya already possessed a complex written language used for religious and dynastic purposes. The San Bartolo murals also provide the earliest visual record of the maize god's resurrection, establishing a mythological foundation for later art and theology. Through these paintings, the Maya expressed not only belief but also historical continuity, a recognition that their world was part of an unfolding cosmic story. Agriculture continued to evolve to sustain growing populations. In the northern lowlands, communities developed innovative methods of water management, including choltons, bottle-shaped underground cisterns carved into limestone to store rainwater. In wetter regions, they created drainage canals and terrace slopes to control flooding. The expansion of maize cultivation, complemented by cacao, cotton, and fruit trees, produced both subsistence and trade commodities. Archaeological analysis of pollen and phytoliths from the Mirador Basin shows that large areas of forest were cleared for cultivation, reflecting not exploitation but planned environmental engineering. The balance between human need and ecological awareness remained a hallmark of Maya sustainability, allowing dense populations to thrive for centuries. Trade networks expanded in both range and complexity. From the Pacific coast came obsidian and salt, from the Caribbean, shells and marine products, from the highlands, jade and hematite. The exchange of goods was accompanied by the exchange of ideas. Artistic motifs such as the jaguar, serpent, and solar symbols spread widely, suggesting shared cosmological concepts across Mesoamerica. The Maya were not isolated but active participants in a regional dialogue that included the Olmec, Zapotec, and early highland cultures. However, the Maya adapted these influences to local conditions, transforming borrowed elements into uniquely Maya expressions. This selective integration fostered cultural resilience and innovation, ensuring that the civilization would evolve independently rather than merely inherit traditions. Social stratification deepened during this period. Archaeological excavations revealed distinct residential patterns separating elite compounds from common dwellings. Elite residences contained finely crafted ceramics, imported goods, and evidence of specialized production, while commoner households focused on subsistence activities. Yet, despite inequality, the system remained interdependent. Commoners provided labor and tribute, while elites offered protection, ritual leadership, and access to trade networks. This reciprocal structure helped maintain social cohesion. The concept of community identity, reinforced through shared ceremonies and public festivals, ensured that even hierarchical societies retained collective stability. The role of ritual specialists and scribes became increasingly important. As writing and calendrical systems developed, a new intellectual class emerged. These individuals maintained knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and ritual timing, disciplines essential for coordinating agriculture, festivals, and state ceremonies. Their ability to interpret celestial movements gave them spiritual prestige and political influence. The alignment of temples with solar and lunar events demonstrates how scientific observation was embedded in religious practice. For the Maya, the study of the heavens was not an abstract pursuit, but a means of harmonizing human activity with cosmic cycles. Urban planning reached new levels of sophistication during the late Preclassic. Cities such as Civil and Saros display carefully aligned architectural groups, each oriented toward specific celestial points. Causeways connected major temples and plazas, facilitating processions and administrative movement. The deliberate symmetry of these layouts reflected the Maya concept of order and balance. Urban space was both functional and symbolic, a microcosm of the universe. Even the arrangement of residential zones followed cosmological logic, with directions and boundaries corresponding to cardinal points and mythic associations. This integration of geography, belief, and governance made the Maya city not just a place to live, but a manifestation of their worldview. By around 400 BCE, these developments culminated in a distinct cultural identity recognizable as fully Maya. The artistic styles, architectural forms, and religious systems of the period formed the blueprint for the classic civilization to come. The pre-classic Maya had transformed their environment, organized their societies, and articulated a vision of the universe in which every action, from planting a seed to raising a pyramid, was part of a greater cosmic pattern. Their achievements were the product of gradual accumulation rather than abrupt revolution, but the outcome was no less profound. The end of the late pre-classic period saw shifts in political and environmental stability. Evidence suggests episodes of population movement and changing trade dynamics, perhaps due to resource pressure or internal competition among cities. Yet these fluctuations did not represent collapse. Rather, they signaled transition. The foundations laid at El Mirador, Nakbi, and other centers would inform the political systems of later dynasties, such as Tikal and Calakmul. The concept of divine kingship, the use of writing for dynastic record, and the integration of ritual and governance, all were established during this formative period. As the first great Maya cities reached their zenith, they also pointed toward the next phase of development, the emergence of independent kingdoms ruled by dynastic lineages. Over the following centuries, power would decentralize, and dozens of regional capitals would rise, each asserting its own divine mandate. The story would shift from shared foundations to competition and alliance, from unified ideology to political complexity. The pre-classic world had built the framework. The classic world would fill it with names, dates, and histories carved in stone. Thus, from the quiet plains of the Petun and the fertile valleys of the highlands, the stage was set for one of humanity's most enduring civilizations to enter its age of recorded history. Between 400 BCE and 250 CE, the Maya world underwent one of its most transformative phases, the emergence of fully formed city-states governed by hereditary dynasties. What had begun as communal leadership and priestly authority evolved into structured kingdoms with defined territories, political hierarchies, and enduring institutions. This period, bridging the late pre-classic and the dawn of the classic era, marks the moment when the Maya became a true civilization in every sense: literate, monumental, and self-aware. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence reveals that during these centuries, the institutions of kingship, statecraft, and religion reached maturity, giving rise to the complex mosaic of cities that would dominate Mesoamerica for centuries. At the heart of this transformation was the rise of divine kingship. The early concept of rulers as intermediaries between humans and gods crystallized into the belief that kings embodied sacred authority itself. The ruler was not merely a political leader, but the earthly vessel of divine will, a living axis connecting the cosmic and human realms. This ideology justified centralized control and monumental expression. Stele, altars, and temple facades began to depict kings performing rituals of bloodletting, sacrifice, and communion with ancestral spirits. Such acts were not personal devotions, but public affirmations of legitimacy. Through ceremony, the ruler sustained both social order and cosmic balance. The political system thus rested on theology, binding the prosperity of the realm to the sanctity of the throne. Tikal, located in the central Petén lowlands, emerged as one of the earliest and most influential centers of this new political order. By 300 BCE, it already exhibited the hallmarks of a true city-state: monumental architecture, planned ceremonial spaces, and a hereditary ruling lineage. Excavations reveal a sequence of construction phases, each layer marking the expansion of authority and the consolidation of state power. Temples, palaces, and administrative compounds were organized around vast plazas designed for processions and public rituals. The city's layout reflected both practical governance and cosmological symbolism. From Tikal's elevated platforms, rulers could oversee the civic heart of the kingdom while performing rituals visible to thousands, a theater of power that merged the sacred and the administrative. The Maya writing system, which had developed during the late Preclassic, now became a crucial tool of governance. Inscriptions carved on stone monuments and painted on ceramics recorded events, lineages, and ceremonial acts. The glyphic script, combining logograms and syllabic signs, allowed for precise communication of names, dates, and religious concepts. This innovation transformed the recording of time and authority. Kings could now inscribe their achievements into history, linking themselves to mythic ancestors and celestial cycles. The Maya long count calendar, based on a complex vigesimal, base, 20 system, tracked days from a mythological creation date in 3114 BCE. Its precision and longevity underscored the civilization's intellectual discipline. Through writing, the Maya created a bridge between ritual memory and historical record, ensuring that power was preserved not just in architecture, but in time itself. Art and iconography also reflected the consolidation of royal ideology. Stone monuments from Tikal, Kemenaljiu, and Izapa display scenes of enthroned rulers attended by nobles, captives, and divine symbols. The recurring imagery of serpents, jaguars, and celestial beings reinforced the concept of the ruler as a cosmic mediator. The throne room or temple platform became the axis mundi, the center of the world, where human governance intersected with divine order. Elaborate costumes made of feathers, jade, and textiles transformed the ruler's body into a living symbol of authority. These representations were not ornamental but political. They conveyed the legitimacy of rule through visual theology. Urbanization accelerated across the lowlands during this time. Cities such as Calakmul, Uaxactan, and Zybanch began to flourish, each asserting regional influence. While trade and cultural exchange remained strong among centers, competition intensified. The emergence of regional capitals led to the development of alliances and rivalries that would later define the Classic period's political landscape. Nonetheless, interdependence remained essential. Shared calendrical systems, ritual practices, and architectural styles maintained cultural unity even amid political diversity. The network of causeways, trade routes, and pilgrimage circuits linked distant cities, transforming the Maya realm into a connected world of independent, yet culturally aligned polities. Religion continued to serve as both social glue and instrument of power. The Maya pantheon expanded, incorporating deities of rain, maize, death, and celestial bodies. Priests and astronomers formed a learned class whose authority rivaled that of the nobility. Rituals of bloodletting and sacrifice, performed by kings and elites, were acts of cosmic maintenance, ensuring the renewal of the sun and the fertility of the earth. Archaeological evidence from sites such as San Bartolo and Lamini reveals altars stained with offerings, ceremonial caches containing jade, obsidian, and shells, and murals depicting mythic narratives of creation and rebirth. The message was clear: the stability of the cosmos depended on human devotion, and the ruler's role was to guarantee that devotion through ritual precision. Agricultural expansion supported this political and spiritual structure. The Maya perfected techniques of raised field farming, terracing, and water management, transforming even marginal landscapes into productive zones. In the Mirador Basin, vast canal systems distributed seasonal rains, while in the limestone lowlands, reservoirs stored water for dry months. These innovations sustained large urban populations and allowed the concentration of labor for monumental construction. Economic surplus underwrote both elite patronage and temple building. Inscriptions occasionally refer to tribute or offerings brought from subordinate towns, suggesting the early formation of tributary systems. The coordination of agricultural and ceremonial calendars linked human labor directly to the cosmic cycles observed by priests and astronomers. Technological and artistic achievements from this period illustrate growing specialization. Ceramics became increasingly elaborate, featuring incised motifs and painted scenes of daily and ritual life. Stone carving reached new levels of precision, and jade ornaments displayed mastery of lapidary technique. The use of red pigment in burials and ceremonial architecture symbolized renewal and sacred power. Each artifact embodied both aesthetic and ideological meaning, reinforcing social identity and continuity. Through such material culture, the Maya expressed an integrated worldview in which art, religion, and governance were inseparable. By 250 BCE, Caminaljiu in the Guatemalan highlands had become a key hub linking highland and lowland economies. Its strategic location near obsidian sources and trade routes to the Pacific coast gave it control over valuable commodities. Excavations reveal richly furnished tombs containing jade, shell, and ceramic offerings, indicating complex hierarchy and far-reaching connections. The city's influence extended across southern Mesoamerica, spreading artistic motifs and calendrical systems that would later appear in classic Maya inscriptions. Caminaljiu's prominence illustrates the growing interdependence of regional centers and the diffusion of elite culture across geographic boundaries. The gradual decline of some pre-classic cities, such as El Mirador, around 150 CE, marked a regional realignment rather than collapse. Shifts in trade, population, or environmental conditions may have contributed to their contraction, but their cultural legacy endured. The architectural templates, religious structures, and political ideologies developed in these centers continued to shape the emerging classic cities. The lineage-based dynasties that took root during this period provided continuity through change, transmitting myths, titles, and symbols of power to new generations of rulers. As the pre-classic era drew to a close, the Maya world stood on the threshold of its most brilliant phase. Writing and calendar systems had matured, kingship was firmly established, and cities dotted the landscape from the Yucatán to Honduras. The stage was set for the explosion of art, architecture, and recorded history that would define the classic period. In the centuries ahead, the dynasties of Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque would transform the Maya into one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. The intellectual, political, and spiritual institutions formed in these centuries were their inheritance, the foundation upon which they would build the monuments, inscriptions, and astronomical achievements that continue to captivate modern scholarship. The evolution of governance during these formative centuries thus represents not a single breakthrough, but a cumulative process of adaptation and innovation. The Maya had learned to harness the resources of their environment, organize large populations, and encode their worldview in both stone and script. The next chapter in their story would see these principles refined and magnified as kingdoms multiplied and rivalries deepened. The dawn of the classic era would bring the Maya to their full expression, a civilization defined by divine rulers, monumental art, and an intellectual culture that sought to measure not just the movements of stars, but the meaning of time itself. From around 250 CE onward, the classic period of Maya civilization began to unfold, a time when its cities, art, and intellectual life reached extraordinary complexity. The foundations laid during the pre-classic centuries matured into a constellation of independent kingdoms, each ruled by dynasties that claimed divine descent and recorded their deeds in stone. Over the next 600 years, the Maya world became one of the most sophisticated political and cultural systems of the pre-Columbian Americas. From Tikal and Calakmul in the lowlands to Palenque, Copan, and Caracol in the peripheries, the classic Maya created a civilization that blended monumental architecture, advanced astronomy, intricate writing, and ritual governance into a single, coherent worldview. The period opened with remarkable urban expansion. At Tikal, construction surged during the 3rd century CE, transforming the city into a regional powerhouse. Massive temple pyramids dominated the landscape, while administrative palaces and ceremonial plazas reflected both civic order and religious purpose. The population of the central lowlands grew rapidly, sustained by intensive agriculture and regional trade. Excavations at Tikal reveal continuous building phases, each sponsored by successive kings to commemorate their reigns and divine legitimacy. The stelae and altars erected in these plazas became public declarations of lineage and cosmic authority. Each carving recorded not only the ruler's name, but also the exact date of dedication using the long count calendar, an unbroken record that remains one of the hallmarks of Maya civilization. The written inscriptions of this era mark a profound intellectual breakthrough. Maya scribes, trained within royal courts, mastered a script capable of expressing the full range of their language, from phonetic syllables to symbolic concepts. They chronicled royal births, accessions, victories, and ritual observances, ensuring that history was preserved with mathematical precision. This integration of literacy into governance distinguished the classic Maya from many of their contemporaries. Writing was both an administrative instrument and a sacred act, linking human events to cosmic cycles. The glyphs carved on stelae and painted on codices demonstrate a worldview where time itself was sacred, each recorded event part of the universe's rhythmic unfolding. Political organization during the classic period was highly decentralized yet culturally unified. Each major city functioned as a kingdom, ruled by a Keola Jah, a holy lord, whose authority derived from divine lineage. These city-states formed shifting networks of alliance, rivalry, and warfare. Tikal and Calakmul emerged as the two dominant powers, their competition shaping the political map of the lowlands. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence from Dos Pilas, Naranjo, and Caracol reveals complex patterns of vassalage and diplomacy. Victories were celebrated with elaborate monuments, while defeats were often recorded with symbolic humility. The balance of power among these kingdoms fluctuated, but the shared cultural code of kingship ensured continuity across generations. The ceremonial centers of the classic era were monumental expressions of both faith and administration. Temples, palaces, ball courts, and causeways formed the physical core of urban life. At Palenque in Chiapas, the Temple of the Inscriptions, constructed in the late 7th century, stands as one of the most sophisticated architectural achievements of the ancient world. Beneath its hieroglyphic panels lies the tomb of King Pakal, whose sarcophagus lid depicts the ruler ascending into the celestial realm. Such monuments were not mere memorials. They articulated a theology of kingship that merged mortality with divinity. The alignment of temples with solar and planetary events further emphasized the inseparable relationship between governance, religion, and astronomy. Astronomical knowledge reached exceptional levels of precision during the classic period. Maya astronomer priests charted the movements of Venus, the moon, and the sun with remarkable accuracy, producing calculations that rival modern observations. Their understanding of celestial cycles informed both agricultural timing and ritual calendars. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya books, preserves tables predicting eclipses and Venus phases, evidence of a mathematical tradition centuries in the making. This fusion of observation, mathematics, and ritual practice demonstrates the Maya commitment to harmonizing human activity with cosmic order. Time was not a passive measurement, but an active dimension of existence, continuously renewed through ceremony and calculation. Art and craftsmanship flourished alongside intellectual achievement. The murals of Bonampak, painted in vivid pigments, depict courtly life, warfare, and ceremonial processions in intricate detail. Stone reliefs and ceramic vessels portray rulers engaged in ritual bloodletting, captives kneeling in submission, and deities bestowing sacred regalia. The art of the classic period was didactic. It instructed the viewer in the moral and cosmic duties of kingship. Even everyday objects carried symbolic meaning. The codified aesthetic of proportion, symmetry, and narrative clarity reflected a broader philosophical commitment to balance and order. Through art, the Maya expressed not only beauty but also the metaphysics of their civilization. Economically, the classic cities were sustained by sophisticated systems of agriculture and exchange. In the northern lowlands, dry season reservoirs and irrigation supported dense populations, while in the highlands and coastal plains, trade in obsidian, salt, cacao, and jade fueled interregional economies. Markets within cities distributed goods ranging from textiles to food staples, and tribute systems ensured the flow of resources from peripheral towns to central authorities. Recent archaeological studies using LiDAR technology have revealed extensive networks of causeways and agricultural terraces, proving that Maya urbanism was supported by deliberate environmental management rather than mere subsistence farming. The relationship between economy and ideology was clear. Prosperity validated divine kingship, and divine kingship ensured prosperity through ritual renewal. Warfare became increasingly institutionalized during the classic period. Unlike the large-scale conquests of other civilizations, Maya warfare was ritualized and often targeted at capturing high-ranking enemies rather than territory. Captives were paraded in public ceremonies and sometimes sacrificed to commemorate victory. Inscriptions describe wars not as acts of aggression, but as moments of cosmic rebalancing, expressions of divine will enacted through human agency. Nonetheless, these conflicts had profound political consequences. The shifting alliances and rivalries among kingdoms contributed to cycles of expansion and decline, particularly between the hegemonic powers of Tikal and Calakmul. The wars they waged over vassal states such as Dos Pilas and Naranjo defined much of the classic period's history and ultimately weakened both empires. The social structure of the classic Maya world was complex yet stable. Beneath the royal elite stood nobles, scribes, artisans, merchants, and farmers, each fulfilling a specific role in the hierarchical order. Commoners maintained agricultural production, participated in construction projects, and supported the religious calendar through offerings and festivals. The interdependence of classes was reinforced by shared cosmological beliefs. Every individual, regardless of rank, was part of a sacred system sustaining the gods and the natural world. This sense of cosmic duty fostered social cohesion, even as inequality persisted. Gender roles within elite society also carried political and spiritual significance. Queens and noblewomen often served as priestesses, diplomats, and regents, as seen in the inscriptions of Naranjo's Lady Six Sky and Palenque's Lady Sac Cook. Their participation in ritual and governance reflected the Maya understanding of gender as complementary rather than subordinate. The duality of male and female powers mirrored broader cosmological principles of balance and regeneration. In both life and ritual, partnership between genders symbolized the cooperation required to sustain the cosmic cycle. By the late 7th and 8th centuries, the classic period reached its artistic and political zenith. Cities across the Maya world flourished simultaneously, each with its own dynastic identity and monumental achievements. The inscriptions from Copan, Quirigua, and Yaxchilan record elaborate rituals of accession, alliance, and warfare, revealing a vibrant world of diplomacy and cultural exchange. Yet beneath the surface of splendor, signs of strain began to emerge. Population growth intensified pressure on agricultural systems. Interkingdom warfare drained resources, and prolonged droughts, identified through paleoclimatic studies, disrupted food supplies. Despite these challenges, the intellectual and artistic legacy of the classic Maya remained unmatched. Their ability to encode history, myth, and mathematics into a single system of expression stands as one of the most sophisticated achievements of ancient thought. By harmonizing empirical observation with spiritual interpretation, the Maya created a civilization that sought coherence between the heavens and the earth, between time and meaning. As the 8th century drew to a close, the balance that had sustained the classic world began to falter. Political fragmentation, environmental stress, and shifting trade routes gradually undermined royal authority. Many of the great cities, including Tikal and Copan, would soon face decline. Yet the principles they embodied, the unity of science, art, and faith, would endure long after their monuments fell silent. The following centuries would witness the transformation of Maya civilization once again, as new centers rose in the north and the nature of power itself adapted to the changing world. The story would continue, but its rhythm would shift from royal inscriptions carved in stone to the enduring traditions of the people who carried Maya identity forward into the next age. As the 8th century progressed, the stability of the great classic Maya kingdoms began to waver. The very systems that had sustained centuries of prosperity, monumental construction, intensive agriculture, and elaborate ritual governance, became sources of strain. Archaeological evidence from across the lowlands indicates that, by around 750 CE, a series of interconnected crises began to erode the foundations of political and social life. Over the next 150 years, one city after another fell silent. This phenomenon, often termed the classic Maya collapse, was not the sudden extinction of a people, but rather a gradual, regionally varied unraveling of a once flourishing civilization. The reasons for this decline were complex, involving environmental, political, and social dimensions. Studies of lake sediments and cave stalagmites across the Yucatán Peninsula suggest prolonged periods of drought beginning in the late 8th century. The Maya had always relied on seasonal rains to sustain their agriculture, particularly in the central lowlands where rivers were scarce. As the climate grew drier, reservoirs and aguadas failed to meet the needs of rapidly growing populations. Deforestation, driven by both farming and monumental construction, likely exacerbated erosion and reduced the capacity of the landscape to retain moisture. These environmental stresses, compounded over decades, destabilized the delicate balance between human settlement and ecological limits. While nature posed formidable challenges, internal dynamics proved equally destructive. The competitive network of city-states, once the engine of artistic and political innovation, turned into a web of perpetual warfare. As resources dwindled, rival kings sought to expand their domains through conquest and tribute. The inscriptions of the late classic era, once filled with records of prosperity and divine legitimacy, increasingly chronicled battles, defeats, and the capture of nobles. Sites such as Dos Pilas and Aguatica reveal clear signs of violent conflict: burned palaces, hastily abandoned homes, and unburied remains. Warfare, once ritualized and bounded by rules of honor, became increasingly destructive, undermining the economic and ideological cohesion that sustained elite authority. At the same time, the ideological foundation of divine kingship began to falter. The rulers of the classic period had justified their authority through their role as intermediaries between gods and people. When droughts persisted and wars intensified, the failure of kings to restore cosmic balance eroded their legitimacy. Inscriptions cease altogether in many regions after 830 CE, marking the end of dynastic lineages that had endured for centuries. Without the binding narrative of divine kingship, local communities began to fragment. Nobles and priests may have attempted to maintain ritual practices, but without centralized leadership, these efforts could not unify the population. The great ceremonial centers, once maintained through collective labor and devotion, were gradually abandoned as the population dispersed. Archaeological layers from sites such as Copan, Tikal, and Palenque reveal the physical consequences of this societal contraction. Temples were left unfinished, plazas fell into disrepair, and residential compounds show evidence of decline in craftsmanship and material wealth. The intricate trade networks that had connected distant regions began to break down. Long-distance exchange in jade, obsidian, and cacao diminished, leaving once thriving markets impoverished. In some regions, like the Patexbatan Basin, entire urban centers were abandoned within a generation. Yet, even as the lowlands emptied, other regions adapted and persisted. The northern Yucatán, less dependent on seasonal rainfall and more integrated with coastal trade routes, became a refuge for surviving populations. Here, cities such as Uxmal, Sale, and Cabá emerged as new centers of activity during what scholars term the Terminal Classic period, 800 to 1000 CE. The architectural style of this era, known as Pyuk, reveals both continuity and innovation. Builders retained traditional forms of stepped pyramids and ceremonial plazas, but emphasized elaborate mosaic facades of stone masks and geometric patterns. These constructions suggest a cultural reorganization rather than collapse, a transformation in which power shifted northward and governance assumed new forms. The city of Uxmal in particular stands out as a symbol of this transition. Its central structure, the Pyramid of the Magician, towers over the surrounding landscape with a rounded profile distinct from earlier constructions. The governor's palace, aligned with astronomical precision, demonstrates that knowledge of celestial cycles continued to guide architecture and ritual. Yet, inscriptions are notably absent in Pyuk's cities, suggesting that the literate bureaucracy of the southern lowlands no longer held sway. Authority was expressed less through dynastic narrative and more through monumental display and regional cooperation. This shift hints at a new model of governance, one that relied less on divine kingship and more on collective or federated leadership among elite lineages. During the same period, the port city of Chichen Itza rose to prominence on the northern plains of Yucatan. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence indicates that by the 10th century, Chichen Itza had become a dominant power, drawing influence from both the remnants of the classic Maya world and the cultures of central Mexico. Its architecture blends Maya and Toltec elements. Feathered serpent motifs, colonnaded halls, and large ball courts evoke a hybrid aesthetic. The Temple of Kukulkan, also known as El Castillo, stands as a precise cosmic instrument, aligned to the equinox sun so that its shadow forms the image of a descending serpent. This synthesis of styles and cosmologies reflects the Maya capacity to absorb and reinterpret external influences without losing their cultural core. The social organization of this era adapted to new realities. The hierarchical structure that had defined classic Maya society gave way to more flexible forms of governance, possibly involving councils of nobles or collective rule among merchant elites. The expansion of maritime trade along the Caribbean coast introduced new economic dynamics. Salt, cotton, obsidian, and cacao flowed between coastal ports, linking the Maya world with distant regions such as the Gulf of Mexico and even the highlands of Guatemala. Chichen Itza's strategic location allowed it to dominate this network, transforming the city into both a religious and commercial hub. Religious practices also evolved. The worship of Kukulkan, a feathered serpent deity associated with wind, water, and creation, became central to northern Maya cosmology. While distinct from earlier deities such as Itzamnij or Chak, Kukulkan embodied similar principles of renewal and cyclical transformation. Rituals remained elaborate, but their focus shifted from dynastic legitimacy to cosmic continuity. Pilgrimages to sacred cenotes, natural sinkholes providing access to groundwater, continued, reinforcing the link between ecology and spirituality. Offerings recovered from the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, including jade, gold, and human remains, attest to the enduring role of sacrifice in maintaining divine balance. By the 11th century, Chichen Itza's dominance began to wane. Internal conflict, possible dynastic disputes, and shifting trade routes contributed to its decline. In its wake rose the city of Mayapan, which became the final great center of post-classic Maya power. Unlike the grand theocracies of earlier times, Mayapan functioned as a confederation, uniting smaller towns under a loose alliance of noble families. This structure, maintained until the mid-15th century, reflected both adaptation and resilience. Although the monumental artistry of the classic period was never fully revived, the Maya continued to sustain urban life, agriculture, and trade within new political frameworks. Across this long transition from collapse to reorganization, what stands out is the persistence of Maya cultural identity. Despite the abandonment of southern cities, the Maya people did not disappear. Their languages, agricultural techniques, calendrical systems, and rituals endured in villages and regional centers across the Yucatán, Chiapas, and Guatemala. The endurance of these traditions illustrates that the so-called collapse was less an end than a reconfiguration. Political systems fell, but the cultural foundations remained intact, ready to evolve under changing historical conditions. By the time Spanish chroniclers first encountered the Maya in the 16th century, they found societies still deeply structured by ancient cosmology and social order. The ruins of Tikal, Palenque, and Copan had long since been reclaimed by forest, yet their memory persisted in oral traditions. The Maya continued to track celestial events, celebrate ritual calendars, and maintain reverence for the earth and sky. Their world had transformed, but its intellectual and spiritual essence endured. The classic Maya collapse, therefore, marks not the disappearance of a civilization, but the end of one phase of its evolution. Environmental stress, warfare, and ideological fatigue dismantled the old order, but from its fragments emerged new centers, new trade systems, and a resilient cultural continuity. The collapse was a process of transformation, the conclusion of one cycle and the preparation for another. As history moved forward, this adaptability would enable Maya culture to survive conquests, colonization, and centuries of change. The next era would witness not decline, but renewal, as the post-classic world took shape from the ruins of the old. By the beginning of the post-classic period, around the 11th century CE, the Maya world had undergone a profound transformation. The political fragmentation of the lowlands and the shift of power toward the northern Yucatan produced a civilization that was at once continuous with its past and strikingly new in form. The cities of this era, Chichen Itza, Mayapan, Tulum, and others, reflected an evolving world shaped by trade, regional alliances, and cultural integration. The legacy of the classic period's intellectual and artistic brilliance persisted, but the framework of divine kingship gave way to more pragmatic structures of governance, diplomacy, and commerce. The post-classic Maya were heirs to a millennium of innovation, and their achievements testify to resilience rather than decline. Chichen Itza stood at the center of this new order during the early post-classic centuries. Located near the northern plains and connected to the Caribbean and Gulf coasts, the city occupied a strategic position for maritime and overland trade. Archaeological studies reveal extensive networks linking Chichen Itza to distant regions. Turquoise and copper from central Mexico, obsidian from highland Guatemala, and jade from Motagua reached its markets. This cosmopolitanism is evident in its architecture and art. The Great Pyramid of Kukulkan, or El Castillo, integrates astronomical precision with symbolic geometry. During the equinoxes, the sun casts a series of triangular shadows down its staircase, forming the illusion of a serpent descending from heaven to earth. This interplay of architecture and celestial motion exemplifies the post-classic Maya's ongoing synthesis of science, ritual, and political authority. The influence of Central Mexican cultures, particularly the Toltecs of Tula, is unmistakable in Chichen Itza's design. The colonnaded halls, warrior statues, and the Temple of the Warriors display motifs and techniques reminiscent of Central Mexico. Yet, rather than evidence of foreign conquest, most scholars interpret this as cultural exchange or emulation. The Maya selectively integrated Toltec elements into their own worldview, producing a hybrid aesthetic that symbolized unity across Mesoamerica. The feathered serpent deity, known as Kukulkan among the Maya and Quetzalcoatl in central Mexico, became the embodiment of this synthesis, an emblem of cosmic wisdom and the fusion of heaven and earth. Trade during the post-classic period expanded far beyond previous scales. Maritime routes along the Yucatan coast connected ports such as Isla Cerritos and Eccoret to inland centers. Canoes transported salt, cotton, cacao, obsidian, and ceramics across hundreds of kilometers, linking the Maya world to the broader economic systems of Mesoamerica. Merchants, known as Palam, gained unprecedented influence, sometimes rivaling the authority of noble families. Inscriptions and murals depict these traders as both economic and spiritual agents, blessed by deities associated with wealth and travel. This mercantile dynamism contributed to a more flexible and interconnected social order, where power was distributed through networks of commerce rather than through the rigid hierarchies of divine kingship. The intellectual traditions of the classic period remained central to Maya life, though adapted to new purposes. The post-classic Maya continued to use the 260-day ritual calendar and the 365-day solar year, aligning their ceremonies with celestial movements. Astronomers maintained observatories, such as the circular structure known as El Caracol at Chichen Itza, designed for tracking Venus and other planets. These studies guided both agricultural planning and ritual scheduling. Codices produced in this period, including the Dresden, Madrid, and Paris codices, preserve elaborate calculations, almanacs, and divinatory charts. They reveal a scientific worldview that integrated mathematics, astronomy, and theology into a unified intellectual system, one that persisted even as political structures evolved. By the 13th century, Chichen Itza's prominence began to fade. Internal discord, possibly involving conflicts among elite lineages or commercial factions, weakened its authority. In its place rose the city of Mayapan, located further west, which became the principal center of power between approximately 1200 and 1450 CE. Unlike Chichen Itza's cosmopolitan grandeur, Mayapan functioned as a confederation, a coalition of noble families and allied towns bound by shared economic and ritual interests. The city's defensive walls, densely packed urban layout, and smaller temples suggest a more practical approach to governance. While still revering Kukulkan, Mayapan's rulers emphasized collective leadership and bureaucratic administration over divine monarchy. Archaeological findings from Mayapan demonstrate remarkable urban organization. The city's population may have reached 15,000, supported by irrigated agriculture and craft specialization. Workshops produced obsidian tools, ceramics, and ornaments for both local use and trade. Murals depict civic rituals, council gatherings, and processions of officials, evidence of an evolving political ethos. Power rested not in a single king, but in a ruling council, possibly led by the Kakam family, who maintained dominance through diplomacy, intermarriage, and trade alliances. This system allowed stability for several centuries, but was not immune to factional rivalry. By the mid-15th century, internal strife and rebellion led to the destruction of Mayapan, ending the last great unified polity of the pre-Columbian Maya world. In the wake of Mayapan's fall, the Yucatán fragmented into numerous smaller provinces known as Cucabolobi. These were governed by local noble lineages who retained much of the administrative and ritual knowledge of earlier times. Towns such as Mani, Tulum, and Cozumel became regional centers, maintaining trade and diplomacy through coastal navigation. The Maya world of the 15th century was politically divided but culturally coherent. Shared language, religion, and calendar kept the scattered provinces linked through tradition and identity. Local rulers sponsored temples, festivals, and markets, ensuring the continuity of community life even without centralized authority. The post-classic era also witnessed enduring religious and artistic creativity. Ceremonial practices continued to revolve around cycles of time, agricultural fertility, and cosmic balance. The worship of rain god Chak remained vital, particularly in the drought-prone northern regions. Cenotes, the natural sinkholes of the limestone plains, served as sacred portals between the earthly and divine realms. Offerings of jade, gold, and human sacrifices discovered within them attest to the depth of devotion that persisted through changing times. Wall paintings at Tulum and murals from Santa Rita Corozal depict deities engaged in cosmic dialogue, reaffirming the Maya vision of a universe governed by balance between order and chaos, light and darkness. Social life in the post-classic period reflected adaptability. Urban centers were smaller but denser, with stone and thatched dwellings arranged around plazas and temples. Markets played a central role in daily life, facilitating exchange not only of goods, but of ideas and social relationships. Women participated in craft production and local trade, while priests, scribes, and astronomers maintained education and ritual. Despite the absence of monumental construction on the scale of the classic era, the intellectual vitality of Maya society endured. Knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics continued to be transmitted orally and through manuscripts. The Maya worldview, rooted in cyclical time, provided a framework for understanding both change and continuity. Collapse and renewal were seen not as opposites, but as phases of an eternal rhythm. This perspective allowed the Maya to integrate historical upheaval into their cosmology. Even as cities rose and fell, the sacred calendar turned unbroken, reaffirming the continuity of existence. This philosophical resilience explains why, when European conquerors arrived in the 16th century, they encountered a living civilization, not ruins of a lost world, but societies still grounded in the intellectual and spiritual traditions that had guided their ancestors for millennia. By the eve of European contact, the Maya had experienced over 2,000 years of continuous cultural evolution. From the divine kings of Tikal to the merchant councils of Mayapan, their political institutions had adapted to changing ecological and social realities. The post-classic Maya maintained networks of trade, religion, and diplomacy that spanned the Yucatán and beyond. Their codices, monuments, and oral traditions carried forward the collective memory of their civilization. The stage was thus set for a new and unprecedented encounter, one that would test their endurance and transform their world once again. The arrival of foreign powers would not mark the end of Maya history, but the beginning of another cycle in their long and remarkable journey. The 16th century brought to the Maya world an upheaval unlike any that had preceded it. The Spanish arrival in the Yucatán Peninsula and the Guatemalan highlands marked a collision between two civilizations with entirely different worldviews, technologies, and conceptions of power. The Maya, whose culture had evolved over millennia through adaptation and continuity, encountered a colonial system based on military conquest, religious conversion, and centralized authority under the Spanish crown. Yet, the encounter did not erase Maya identity. Instead, it initiated a long process of resistance, negotiation, and cultural survival that continues to shape Maya communities to this day. The first recorded contact occurred in 1502, when Christopher Columbus's fourth voyage met Maya traders off the coast of Honduras. These merchants navigated large canoes laden with cotton textiles, cacao, obsidian blades, and copper bells, a sign that Maya trade networks were still vibrant on the eve of European intrusion. 2 decades later, Spanish expeditions led by Francisco Hernández de Córdoba and Juan de Grijalva explored the Yucatán coastline, encountering organized towns and sophisticated political systems. When Hernán Cortés landed in 1519 and began his campaign against the Aztec Empire, he brought with him reports of the Maya lands to the east and south, regions that would become targets of future conquest. The Spanish invasion of the Maya world was protracted and fragmented. Unlike the centralized Aztec Empire, the Maya were divided into numerous independent provinces, each ruled by its own lineage. This decentralization made conquest both difficult and drawn out. Beginning in the 1520s, Spanish forces under Pedro de Alvarado invaded the Guatemalan highlands, where they confronted powerful kingdoms such as the Kich, Caxical, and Mam. Despite fierce resistance, superior weaponry and the spread of European diseases led to rapid military defeat. In 1524, the Kich, capital of Camargue, fell, followed by the capture of neighboring states. Alvarado's campaigns combined violence with strategic alliances, enlisting rival Maya groups against one another, a pattern repeated throughout the colonial conquests of the Americas. In the Yucatán lowlands, resistance was even more tenacious. From 1527 to 1546, the Spanish waged intermittent campaigns against the northern provinces, facing both guerrilla warfare and logistical challenges. Francisco de Montejo and his son led successive expeditions that established footholds along the coast, but met fierce opposition inland. The Itza of Central Petén, centered at Tayasal near Lake Petanitsa, maintained independence for nearly 2 centuries. Only in 1697 did Spanish forces under Martín de Ursúa finally conquer Tayasal, making it the last autonomous Maya city to fall in the Americas. This extraordinary persistence underscores the resilience and adaptability that had characterized Maya civilization for thousands of years. Spanish colonization brought radical transformations in governance, economy, and religion. The encomienda system distributed land and labor to Spanish settlers, forcing Maya communities into tribute and agricultural production for colonial elites. Towns were reorganized according to the Spanish grid plan, with a central plaza dominated by a church and government buildings. Yet beneath this imposed order, traditional structures of authority persisted. Local noble families, often co-opted into colonial administration, continued to mediate between their communities and Spanish officials. In many regions, Maya languages remained the medium of local governance, and pre-Hispanic town boundaries survived under new names. Religious conversion was a central objective of colonial policy. Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries established monasteries and schools throughout the Yucatán and Highlands, seeking to replace indigenous beliefs with Catholic doctrine. The process was far from uniform. While outward conversion was widespread, many Maya communities integrated Christian symbols into their own cosmological frameworks. Saints were identified with ancestral deities, churches were built over sacred sites, and festivals merged Christian liturgy with agricultural and seasonal rituals. This syncretism allowed the Maya to preserve continuity under the guise of conformity, creating a layered spiritual tradition that endures in modern practice. The colonial period also gave rise to new forms of writing and historical reflection. The Popol Vuh, compiled by Kitch scribes in the mid-16th century, preserved ancient creation narratives and dynastic histories in alphabetic script, combining indigenous oral traditions with European writing systems. Similarly, the books of Chilam Balam from Yucatan recorded prophecies, rituals, and local histories that bridged pre-Columbian and colonial worldviews. These texts stand as testaments to intellectual resistance, efforts to safeguard cultural memory within a transformed world. Through them, the Maya voice continued to speak with historical consciousness, ensuring that their understanding of time and identity remained intact despite conquest. Economically, the colonial order redirected labor towards Spanish interests. Indigenous communities were required to pay tribute in goods or currency, often through forced production of cotton, honey, or maize. Over time, population decline from disease, warfare, and displacement disrupted traditional agricultural cycles. Yet the Maya demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Communal landholding systems known as ejidos allowed villages to maintain a measure of autonomy, while subsistence farming ensured local survival. Markets persisted, connecting rural producers with urban centers such as Mérida and Santiago de Guatemala. The endurance of these economic patterns provided the basis for cultural continuity even under oppressive colonial constraints. Resistance, both overt and subtle, was a recurring feature of Maya life under Spanish rule. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, rebellions erupted across the Yucatán and Highlands. One of the most significant was the Yucatán Uprising of 1546, in which coordinated attacks by multiple provinces nearly expelled Spanish settlers before being suppressed. Other forms of resistance were quieter but equally enduring. The preservation of language, the clandestine practice of ancestral rituals, and the maintenance of communal solidarity. In many areas, remote geography and dense forests provided refuge for communities seeking to preserve autonomy beyond direct colonial control. The conquest period closed one chapter of Maya history, but opened another defined by endurance through adaptation. The intellectual and spiritual legacy of earlier ages continued to guide social life, often beneath the surface of colonial authority. The cyclical conception of time, central to Maya philosophy, provided a means of interpreting conquest not as an absolute end, but as another turn in the cosmic order. The Spanish presence was immense, but the Maya capacity for cultural resilience proved deeper still. By the late 17th century, The formal conquest of all Maya territories was complete, yet colonial control remained fragile. The survival of language, ritual, and communal organization ensured that Maya identity did not vanish but transformed. In every town and village, traces of the ancient world persisted. The rhythm of agricultural festivals, the geometry of sacred spaces, and the moral weight of ancestral memory. What emerged was not a conquered people, but a civilization adapting to an altered landscape, one that would endure through centuries of colonial rule and into the modern age. The next stage of their story would unfold under the long shadow of European empire, where survival required the careful balance of resistance and accommodation. Even as new systems of faith and governance took hold, the Maya continued to navigate history on their own terms, guided by the same enduring belief that all things, even conquest, occur within cycles of renewal. In the centuries that followed the conquest, the Maya world entered a prolonged period of adjustment and endurance. Spanish rule had altered every visible structure of life, political, religious, and economic. Yet beneath the imposed hierarchy, a deep continuity remained. From the 16th through the 18th centuries, Maya communities across Yucatán, Belize, Guatemala, and Chiapas preserved language, ritual, and social organization in ways that adapted old patterns to new realities. This period, often seen as one of silence, was in truth an era of cultural negotiation, the deliberate reshaping of identity within the constraints of colonial rule. Maya society during the colonial centuries was characterized by a dual structure. On one level, Spanish institutions dominated: the church, the encomienda system, and later the repartimiento labor drafts. On another level, traditional community governance persisted in the form of cabildos, indigenous town councils that maintained local order, resolved disputes, and coordinated religious festivals. These councils, though monitored by Spanish officials, served as the continuation of pre-Hispanic lineage-based leadership. Through them, the Maya preserved a sense of local autonomy, translating ancient systems of responsibility into the vocabulary of the colonial world. Religion remained the central field of cultural negotiation. Missionaries had sought to replace ancestral deities with Catholic saints, but in practice, the two worlds fused. In highland towns such as Chichicastenango, Totonicapan, and Solola, processions in honor of saints were timed to coincide with older agricultural and calendrical rituals. Beneath church altars, sacred caves and springs retained their significance as places of offering and renewal. The fusion of Christian and Maya elements produced a layered cosmology that defied simple classification. What outsiders perceived as superstition was, for the Maya, the continuation of a sacred dialogue with the natural and spiritual worlds under new symbols. Economic life revolved around subsistence agriculture and local markets. Despite colonial exactions, the Maya continued to cultivate maize, beans, squash, and cacao, sustaining both family and community. Markets operated as social centers, linking villages across linguistic and regional boundaries. Archaeological and archival evidence reveals that barter remained common, and that women played key roles as traders and weavers, preserving textile patterns with motifs traceable to pre-Columbian iconography. Cotton and indigo production for Spanish markets introduced new pressures, yet local economies retained autonomy by blending cash production with traditional exchange systems. The colonial legal system also became a space for resistance. Maya communities learned to use Spanish law to their advantage, filing petitions and lawsuits to defend communal lands from encroachment. Surviving court documents from the 17th and 18th centuries show a remarkable fluency in written Spanish among indigenous scribes. These documents not only assert economic rights, but also articulate a distinct political consciousness, a recognition that the colonial framework, though imposed, could be turned into a tool of preservation. The ability to navigate both worlds, linguistic and institutional, was itself a form of endurance. Population recovery after the devastation of the early colonial period was gradual but steady. By the 18th century, many Maya regions saw renewed demographic growth, leading to the expansion of villages and the reoccupation of abandoned lands. This revival coincided with renewed Spanish interest in economic exploitation, particularly through the expansion of haciendas and cattle ranches. Tensions between communal landholding and private property became a defining feature of colonial life. In many cases, communities responded by intensifying their internal cohesion, reinforcing traditions of mutual labor exchange and ritual solidarity. Throughout this time, oral traditions continued to transmit historical memory. The stories of ancestral cities, dynastic founders, and cosmic cycles were preserved in both speech and performance. Ritual specialists maintained the use of the 260-day calendar for divination, planting, and healing, even as official authorities condemned such practices. This quiet continuity linked generations across centuries, ensuring that the sense of being Maya, distinct yet adaptable, survived every political and religious transformation. In the late 18th century, Spanish colonial reforms, known as the Bourbon Reforms, sought to modernize administration and tighten control over indigenous populations. These measures disrupted long-standing arrangements. The imposition of new taxes, the expansion of Spanish-only schools, and restrictions on indigenous officials provoked unrest. In several highland towns, revolts erupted against increased tribute demands. The most notable occurred in 1761, when Jacinto Canic led an uprising in Cistile, Yucatan. Though swiftly suppressed, Canic's revolt echoed earlier traditions of millenarian resistance, the belief that oppression would one day be overturned through cosmic renewal. His execution became symbolic of the tension between imposed order and enduring autonomy. By the dawn of the 19th century, the colonial order was showing signs of strain. Enlightenment ideas circulated through the colonies, and wars of independence in other parts of Latin America stirred expectations of change. For the Maya, these global shifts had complex implications. On the one hand, independence from Spain promised relief from tribute and missionary control. On the other, new national elites often perpetuated systems of inequality inherited from the colonial era. When independence movements swept through Central America in the 1820s, many Maya communities found themselves once again navigating a transformed political landscape, neither entirely free nor wholly subjugated. Through 3 centuries of foreign domination, the Maya had demonstrated a pattern that would define their entire history: adaptation without surrender. Their towns had become colonial parishes, their rituals had taken Christian form, their languages had absorbed Spanish vocabulary. Yet the underlying principles of social reciprocity, sacred geography, and cyclical time endured. Archaeology, ethnohistory, and modern anthropology all attest to this remarkable continuity, a civilization that survived not by isolation, but by transformation. As the 19th century approached, the stage was set for new upheavals. The collapse of colonial authority opened space for both opportunity and renewed exploitation. The ancient tension between autonomy and external power would once again shape the course of Maya history, this time under the emerging republics of Mexico and Central America. The coming centuries would test the capacity for endurance that had sustained the Maya since the first farmers began to shape the jungles of the lowlands into cities of stone. The 19th century marked a profound turning point in the history of the Maya people. The collapse of Spanish colonial authority across Latin America gave rise to new republics, each aspiring to modernity and independence. Yet, for the Maya, these changes brought few immediate benefits. The end of colonial rule simply exchanged one system of domination for another. Creole and mestizo elites replaced Spanish administrators, but the structures of economic inequality and political marginalization remained largely intact. Across the Yucatán Peninsula, Chiapas, Belize, and the Guatemalan highlands, the Maya entered the modern era as subjects of nations that seldom recognized their autonomy or heritage. The newly independent states of Mexico and Central America sought to integrate indigenous communities into national economies based on commercial agriculture. In Yucatan, this took the form of large-scale henequen plantations, whose fibers became essential for making rope and cordage during the industrial boom of the late 19th century. To supply labor, local authorities imposed debt peonage systems, binding Maya workers to estates through credit and coercion. Communal lands, once protected under colonial arrangements, were increasingly privatized, dispossessing villages and forcing migration to plantation regions. This process mirrored broader Latin American trends in which indigenous people were seen not as citizens, but as sources of labor for modernization. At the same time, governments promoted policies of assimilation. Spanish-language education, Christian instruction, and dress codes sought to erase distinct indigenous identities in favor of a homogenized national culture. In Guatemala, the liberal reforms of the 1870s confiscated communal lands and secularized church property, transferring vast tracts to coffee planters. Similar transformations occurred in Chiapas and western Honduras, where indigenous peasants were absorbed into new export economies. Yet, beneath these shifts, local traditions persisted. Many Maya continued to practice collective agriculture, maintain ritual calendars, and hold community assemblies in defiance of official structures. These growing pressures culminated in one of the most dramatic uprisings in Latin American history, the Caste War of Yucatán. Beginning in 1847, Maya communities of the eastern and southern peninsula rose in rebellion against decades of land seizure, forced labor, and racial discrimination. The conflict began when local leaders, angered by tax collection and encroachments on their autonomy, organized coordinated attacks on towns dominated by non-indigenous settlers. Within months, most of the peninsula was under Maya control. For a time, it appeared that Spanish-descended elites might be entirely expelled from Yucatán. The caste war evolved into a protracted struggle lasting more than half a century. At its height, rebel forces established an autonomous Maya state centered on Chon Santa Cruz, modern-day Felipe Carrillo Puerto. There, local leaders combined traditional authority with a new syncretic religion centered on the talking cross, a symbol of divine guidance and collective resistance. The Chon Santa Cruz polity maintained diplomatic contacts, even with foreign powers such as Britain, which controlled neighboring Belize. The rebellion defied Mexican control until the early 20th century, when the Mexican army finally subdued the region. Yet, even then, full pacification proved elusive. Remote villages continued to resist taxation and conscription well into the 20th century. The caste war left deep marks on both sides. For the Maya, it reaffirmed a long tradition of self-determination and spiritual resilience. For the Yucatecan elite, it hardened racial hierarchies and justified further militarization. The legacy of the war extended far beyond the battlefield. It symbolized the enduring tension between indigenous autonomy and national integration, a dynamic that continues to shape the cultural politics of the region. In the Guatemalan highlands, similar but smaller-scale forms of resistance unfolded throughout the 19th century. Communities resisted the expansion of coffee estates and defended communal forests and pastures against privatization. Some uprisings invoked prophetic or messianic language, anticipating the return of ancestral order. Others relied on legal strategies, petitions, and negotiations to protect village boundaries. The outcome was uneven. Many communities lost land, but others managed to preserve internal cohesion by adapting religious brotherhoods, cofradias, into mechanisms of both faith and governance. By the late 19th century, the global fascination with the ancient Maya past began to emerge. Archaeological expeditions from Europe and the United States ventured into the jungles of Yucatán, Chiapas, and Guatemala in search of ruins long abandoned to the forest. Explorers such as John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood published vivid accounts of their discoveries, revealing to the wider world the grandeur of Maya architecture and art. While their works popularized the civilization, they often romanticized the past at the expense of the living Maya, portraying contemporary communities as remnants rather than descendants. Nevertheless, their publications spurred systematic archaeological research, laying the foundation for the academic field of Maya studies. The rediscovery of the ancient cities coincided with a renewed interest among the Maya themselves in their ancestral heritage. Oral traditions long preserved memories of lost kingdoms and sacred centers, often associated with caves or ruined temples. As archaeological and linguistic scholarship advanced, these connections became increasingly evident. The recognition that the people of the highlands and lowlands were heirs to the same civilization fostered a quiet resurgence of cultural pride, one that would find fuller expression in the 20th century. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Maya world remained divided among emerging nation-states, yet unified by shared patterns of endurance. Despite political marginalization, the core elements of Maya life, community solidarity, ritual reciprocity, and respect for sacred landscapes, persisted. The rhythm of agricultural life, guided by both Christian calendars and ancestral cosmology, continued to define the seasons. Language, transmitted through family and ritual, remained the most enduring marker of identity. This period of transformation revealed the fundamental adaptability that had always characterized Maya civilization. Whether under kings, conquistadors, or republics, the Maya maintained continuity through reinterpretation. They absorbed external forces without surrendering their sense of time or their relationship to the land. By doing so, they bridged the ancient and the modern, carrying forward traditions that would endure into the challenges and cultural revivals of the 20th century. The next phase of their history would unfold under the pressures of modernization, global attention, and new struggles for recognition. As the modern states of Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize took shape, the question of what it meant to be Maya and how that identity could coexist with national citizenship would define the path of a civilization that had never ceased to exist, only to adapt. The 20th century began with the Maya world divided among modern nation-states that viewed indigenous populations through the lens of assimilation and economic development. Governments in Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize pursued policies aimed at national unification, often at the expense of cultural diversity. Yet the Maya, who had endured empires, conquest, and colonial rule, now entered a new era defined not by disappearance, but by persistence within modernization. Across towns and villages, they reinterpreted identity, maintained local governance, and adapted traditions to the realities of industrial economies, missionary efforts, and global politics. This was the age of survival through transformation, a continuation of a pattern that had endured for more than 3,000 years. In Mexico, the early 20th century brought the upheaval of the revolution, 1910 to 1920. The Yucatán Peninsula, still scarred by the caste war, became a theater of competing ideologies. Revolutionary leaders promised land reform and equality for indigenous peoples, but results were uneven. In the decades that followed, the Mexican state promoted an ideology known as indigenismo, a celebration of indigenous heritage as part of national identity, but one that often ignored living communities. Ancient Maya art and architecture were displayed as symbols of Mexico's greatness, while rural Maya populations continued to face poverty, marginalization, and limited access to education. Nonetheless, the revolutionary period opened new avenues for cultural and political expression, including the gradual recognition of indigenous rights within the national discourse. In Guatemala, the 20th century unfolded amid cycles of reform and repression. The early decades were marked by economic dependence on coffee exports, controlled by a small elite. Maya communities supplied much of the labor for plantations under conditions that differed little from colonial servitude. Efforts at modernization brought roads and schools, but also deepened inequalities. By mid-century, revolutionary governments under Juan José Arevalo, 1945 to 1951, and Jacobo Arbenz, 1951 to 1954, sought to address these disparities through social reform and land redistribution. Arbenz's agrarian reform, in particular, aimed to restore land to peasant farmers, many of them Maya. However, the 1954 coup, backed by foreign interests, reversed these gains and initiated decades of authoritarian rule. The late 20th century in Guatemala was dominated by civil conflict. From 1960 to 1996, a brutal internal war pitted guerrilla movements against military regimes. The Maya highlands became the primary battleground, as government forces targeted villages suspected of supporting insurgents. Entire communities were destroyed in counterinsurgency campaigns that international observers later recognized as acts of genocide. Between 1981 and 1983 alone, thousands of civilians were killed or displaced. Yet, even amid this devastation, Maya culture persisted. Refugee camps became spaces of cultural renewal, where language and ritual were maintained as acts of defiance. In the aftermath of the war, survivors emerged determined to preserve memory and seek justice, linking ancestral endurance with modern human rights struggles. In Belize, where British colonial rule persisted until 1981, the Maya experience took a different path. Keki, Mopin, and Yucatec communities in southern Belize maintained agricultural and ritual traditions while navigating colonial administration and missionary activity. The 20th century brought new migrations from Guatemala and Mexico, creating a mosaic of Maya populations within the small territory. After independence, Belize gradually recognized the cultural and territorial rights of its indigenous communities, culminating in legal victories affirming land ownership and the protection of sacred sites. These developments reflected a broader shift across the region, the growing assertion of indigenous identity within modern legal and political frameworks. Language preservation emerged as one of the central forms of continuity. Across Mesoamerica, millions continued to speak Maya languages such as Kitch, Caxical, Keki, Tz'il, and Yucatec. Scholars and community leaders collaborated to create orthographies, dictionaries, and literacy programs, ensuring that these languages would not vanish. The revival of Maya literature and poetry in the late 20th century marked a return to written expression that had roots in the hieroglyphic inscriptions of the ancient cities. Radio programs, schools, and local publications began to use indigenous languages, bridging oral tradition and modern media. Archaeology and anthropology during this period brought renewed global attention to the Maya. Excavations at sites such as Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Calakmul transformed scholarly understanding of Maya history. The decipherment of the hieroglyphic script, advanced by researchers including Tatiana Proskuryakov and Yuri Norisov, revealed that the inscriptions were not mystical symbols, but historical records of kings, wars, and dynasties. This revelation reframed the Maya not as a vanished people, but as a literate civilization with complex political and intellectual traditions. For modern Maya communities, these discoveries offered both pride and controversy. Pride in recognition of ancestral sophistication and concern over the appropriation of cultural heritage by outsiders. By the late 20th century, cultural revitalization movements were gaining momentum. In Guatemala, the Pan-Maya movement united diverse linguistic groups in a collective effort to reclaim identity and rights. This movement emphasized education, cultural pride, and political representation, often invoking the cyclical worldview of Maya philosophy as a metaphor for renewal after centuries of subjugation. In Mexico, indigenous activists in Chiapas, most famously through the 1994 Zapatista uprising, demanded autonomy, land reform, and respect for indigenous cultures. The Zapatista movement, though rooted in local grievances, drew on ancient Maya imagery and values, linking past and present in a struggle for dignity and justice. Globalization further transformed the Maya world. Tourism expanded rapidly in the late 20th century, turning ancient sites into major destinations. While this brought economic opportunity, it also posed challenges of preservation and cultural control. Many communities established cooperatives to manage heritage sites and promote responsible tourism that respects sacred landscapes. Simultaneously, Maya artisans, weavers, and spiritual leaders began to share their traditions internationally, reframing identity not as relic but as living culture. By centuries' end, the Maya stood at a crossroads of tradition and modernity. They were no longer invisible subjects within national histories, but active participants in shaping their future. The endurance that had carried them through millennia now manifested as organized activism, linguistic renewal, and cultural creativity. Archaeologists uncovered the splendor of the ancient world, while living communities asserted the continuity of that civilization in daily practice. The Maya were both ancient and modern, farmers and scholars, spiritual leaders, and political activists, united by a shared heritage and a profound sense of time. As the 21st century approached, their story had come full circle. The civilization that had once built the great cities of the rainforest, endured conquest, and survived colonialism now reasserted itself as a modern people with an ancient memory. The next chapter of their history would not be written in stone, but in classrooms, councils, and community movements, a continuation of the same resilient dialogue between past and present that has always defined the Maya world. The 21st century has become a time of renewed visibility and resilience for the Maya. After centuries of marginalization, the descendants of the builders of Palenque, Tikal, and Copan now participate actively in national life, regional governance, and global cultural exchange. The modern era has seen the convergence of ancient knowledge and contemporary challenges, the preservation of identity in an age of globalization, the defense of land in the face of development, and the reaffirmation of spiritual traditions within modern pluralism. The Maya are no longer spoken of as a lost civilization. They are recognized as a living people, shaping their own present while maintaining a continuous link to one of humanity's most enduring cultural legacies. Across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, an estimated 7 to 8 million Maya people live in rural villages and urban centers alike. They speak over 30 distinct but related languages, maintaining a diversity that reflects both ancient fragmentation and modern adaptability. Linguistic revitalization programs, often initiated by local educators, have transformed schools into centers of cultural renewal. In Guatemala, bilingual education has become a constitutional right, allowing children to study in their native kitsch, quechua, or mam, while also learning Spanish. In Yucatan, community initiatives support the preservation of Yucatec Maya through media, literature, and digital archives. This linguistic continuity connects the spoken present to the written brilliance of the classic era, reaffirming that Maya civilization never truly ended, it evolved. Cultural revitalization also extends to the spiritual sphere. Traditional ceremonies marking planting, harvest, and renewal continue across the highlands and lowlands, often in sites that have been sacred for millennia. Fire ceremonies, conducted by Ajkaijab, timekeepers or spiritual guides, use the 260-day ritual calendar to align human action with cosmic cycles. These ceremonies are performed in caves, mountains, and ancient temples, symbolizing the continuity of sacred geography. For many communities, such practices coexist with Catholicism or evangelical Christianity, forming a uniquely Maya synthesis of belief. This religious pluralism exemplifies the enduring flexibility of their worldview, an understanding of the world as layered rather than divided. Modern political life has likewise seen the rise of Maya participation and activism. In Guatemala, the peace accords of 1996 formally recognized the country as multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multilingual, granting indigenous peoples specific rights. However, the implementation of these provisions has been slow, prompting new waves of organization. Maya leaders, many of them trained in anthropology, law, or linguistics, have formed councils to advocate for land rights, cultural heritage protection, and environmental justice. The Pan-Maya movement continues to articulate a vision of national inclusion rooted in ancestral values of community and reciprocity. Similarly, in southern Mexico, Maya voices have played an essential role in broader indigenous movements, most notably in the Zapatista struggle, which emphasizes dignity, local governance, and respect for the earth. Land remains at the heart of modern Maya struggles. Large-scale mining, hydroelectric projects, and deforestation threaten both livelihoods and sacred landscapes. Communities have organized referendums, legal challenges, and protests to defend their territories. The Maya conception of land, not as property, but as a living entity tied to ancestry and spiritual balance, has provided a powerful counterpoint to modern extractive economies. In some regions, community-managed forests and agricultural cooperatives have emerged as models of sustainable stewardship, blending traditional ecological knowledge with contemporary conservation science. International recognition of these efforts has brought both solidarity and new responsibilities, as global attention increases pressure on fragile ecosystems. Technology and globalization have introduced both challenges and opportunities. Internet access and social media have given Maya communities tools to share their stories, teach their languages, and connect with the global diaspora. Online archives preserve oral histories, while digital mapping projects document sacred sites and linguistic boundaries. Yet modernization has also accelerated migration, as many young Maya leave rural villages for cities or foreign countries in search of work. This movement has created new cultural hybrids, urban Maya identities that combine ancestral memory with cosmopolitan experience. Across the Americas, Maya migrants organize cultural associations, celebrate traditional festivals, and use technology to maintain ties to their home villages. Archaeology continues to play a complex role in the modern Maya world. Ongoing discoveries at sites such as El Mirador, Caracol, and Holmel reveal the scale and sophistication of ancient urbanism, while LiDAR technology has mapped vast networks of roads and reservoirs hidden beneath the forest canopy. These findings reshape academic understanding, but they also raise questions of ownership and representation. Increasingly, Maya scholars and local guides participate directly in archaeological research, reclaiming the narrative of their ancestors. Museums and heritage programs are beginning to integrate indigenous perspectives, emphasizing continuity rather than disappearance. Through these collaborations, the boundaries between ancient history and living culture grow ever more porous. Cultural expression in art, literature, and music has also flourished. Contemporary Maya poets and novelists write in both indigenous languages and Spanish, exploring themes of identity, memory, and social justice. Weavers continue to encode cosmological symbols and textile patterns, transforming ancestral motifs into living art. Filmmakers and digital artists document rituals, oral traditions, and the struggles of modern communities, ensuring that global audiences encounter the Maya not as ruins, but as voices. This creative flowering reclaims narrative authority long dominated by outsiders, reaffirming that the Maya are subjects of their own history. In Belize and southern Mexico, tourism has become a major economic factor, offering both benefit and risk. Community-run projects seek to ensure that revenue from heritage sites supports local education and conservation rather than external investors. Initiatives at places like Uxmal, Copan, and Lamani integrate indigenous guides and storytellers who interpret history through a Maya lens. By teaching visitors about continuity rather than collapse, these programs help correct centuries of misconception. The challenge remains to balance economic opportunity with cultural integrity, a negotiation that echoes older patterns of adaptation. The 21st century has also brought a reawakening of Maya environmental philosophy. The ancient understanding of time as cyclical and of humans as stewards rather than masters of nature aligns closely with global sustainability movements. In rural Guatemala, spiritual leaders perform ceremonies to bless seeds and rivers, reminding communities that ecological balance is inseparable from social harmony. Maya scholars increasingly engage with environmental policy, advocating for the inclusion of indigenous cosmology in climate strategies. In this way, the wisdom of the ancient world contributes to the most urgent challenges of the modern one. Today, the Maya exist not as relics of a vanished civilization, but as a diverse network of communities across 5 nations, united by history and bound by continuity. Their story is one of resilience across millennia, a civilization that has faced collapse, conquest, and colonization, yet never extinction. From the stele of the classic cities to the bilingual schools of the present, the thread of identity has remained unbroken. The Maya continue to interpret time as a cycle, where each era carries forward the essence of those before it. As the world looks to the future, the Maya remind us that civilization is not measured only by monuments or empires, but by the capacity of a people to endure, adapt, and remember. Through archaeology, language, and living tradition, their story continues, not in ruins reclaimed by the forest, but in voices, rituals, and communities that still breathe the rhythm of an ancient world. The Maya have not vanished into history. They are its living continuation, offering humanity a lesson in endurance, balance, and the timeless art of renewal.